She signed her dismissal while hiding her pregnancy. 7 years later, the Mafia Boss learned the trust. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a quick favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our channel's latest videos. It only takes a moment. It is completely free, and it is one of the best ways to support us as we continue bringing you more dramatic and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means so much to us. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Share your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let us return to our main character and continue the story. A single signature can end a career, but sometimes it buries an entire life before anyone realizes what was lost. I had signed contracts worth billions of dollars without reading them twice because the people around me had earned my trust years earlier. I had shaken hands with governors, senators, and executives who smiled in front of cameras while calculating their next move behind closed doors. Men who controlled entire industries waited outside my office instead of making me wait for them. That was the life I had built, one decision after another, one sacrifice after another. Power had become routine. Wealth had become ordinary. Even silence had become familiar. Yet nothing in my world prepared me for a faded personnel file resting on the corner of my desk one quiet Monday morning. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blackwood Tower, casting long golden reflections across polished hardwood floors. 48 stories below, Manhattan pulsed with its usual rhythm. Yellow taxis drifted through intersections. Steam curled from subway grates. Construction cranes stretched toward the sky as though the city itself refused to stop growing. I usually admired that view because it reminded me how far I had come. That morning I barely noticed it. My legal department had begun reviewing archived employment records connected to an acquisition completed years earlier. Boxes that had collected dust in storage were finally being organized, and someone thought I might need to approve the destruction of outdated files. Normally, I would have delegated the task without another thought. Instead, for reasons I still cannot explain, I reached for the oldest folder in the stack. The cardboard edges had softened with age. A thin layer of dust settled against my fingertips as I opened it. Inside were dozens of ordinary documents. Hiring forms, performance evaluations, payroll adjustments, people I barely remembered, lives that had crossed mine for only a moment before continuing without me. Then I turned one page, and time stopped. Claire Bennett. Her name sat quietly at the top of an official dismissal form, typed in the same ordinary font used for every employee in the company. There was nothing remarkable about the paper itself. The ink had faded slightly over the years. The corners had yellowed. Yet my heartbeat slowed so suddenly that I could hear the ticking clock mounted above the bookshelf behind me. My eyes traveled to the bottom of the page where her signature rested with calm confidence. Exactly the way she used to sign birthday cards, lunch receipts, and little handwritten notes she slipped into my briefcase when she thought I was working too hard. I had not spoken her name aloud in 7 years. I had forbidden myself from asking where she went because every answer I imagined hurt more than the silence. I told myself she had chosen another life. I convinced myself she no longer wanted the future we once planned together. Repeating those lies had become easier than admitting I never understood why she disappeared. I lifted the dismissal form carefully, noticing another document partially hidden beneath it. The dates matched perfectly. Same day, same hour. My chest tightened with a feeling I had not experienced in years. Regret has a strange way of arriving without warning. It does not knock. It simply sits beside you until you finally notice it has been there all along. Outside my office, phones continued ringing. Elevators opened and closed. Meetings started exactly on schedule. The entire city moved forward while I remained trapped inside one forgotten moment from 7 years earlier. I stared at Claire's signature one last time before whispering the question that should have been asked the day she vanished. What if she never left because she wanted to? The date on Claire's dismissal form pulled me backward with a force stronger than memory itself. 7 years earlier, I still believed I could protect the people I loved simply by working harder than everyone else. Every morning began before sunrise with board meetings, financial reports, and endless negotiations that stretched across time zones. My calendar left little room for anything else, yet somehow I always found 15 minutes to visit the executive floor where Claire worked. She never asked for those moments. She simply smiled whenever I appeared outside her office carrying 2 cups of coffee, pretending it was an accident that I had ordered her favorite vanilla latte instead of my usual black coffee. She made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. She reminded me to eat lunch when I skipped meals. She laughed whenever I loosened my tie after another exhausting meeting and insisted that no amount of money could replace a quiet walk through Central Park. Around her, I stopped feeling like the man everyone expected me to be. I was simply Damien. Looking back now, I realize peace can disappear without making a sound. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in early October. I was preparing to meet Claire for dinner after work. She had called that morning and said she had something important to tell me, something she wanted to say face to face instead of over the phone. She sounded nervous, but there was excitement hidden beneath it. I spent the entire day wondering whether she was finally ready to accept my proposal. The engagement ring had been waiting inside my desk for almost 3 weeks because I wanted everything to be perfect. Just after noon, my chief operating officer rushed into the conference room carrying documents about an unexpected crisis involving one of our overseas investments. Millions of dollars and hundreds of employees depended on immediate decisions. Within an hour, I was boarding a company jet bound for London with meetings scheduled straight through the next morning. Before the aircraft doors closed, I called Claire 3 times. Each call went directly to voicemail. I left a message promising that I would explain everything as soon as I landed. I believed there would be plenty of time when I returned. I could not have been more wrong. 48 hours later, I walked back into Blackwood Tower expecting to surprise her with flowers before apologizing for missing dinner. Instead, my executive assistant met me outside my office holding a sealed envelope. She could barely look at me. Inside was a copy of Claire Bennett's voluntary dismissal paperwork. Effective immediately. Signed 2 days earlier. My first reaction was confusion. Claire loved her work. She had never once mentioned resigning. I called her cell phone again. Straight to voicemail. I drove to her apartment in Brooklyn that evening through pouring rain, only to find the building manager replacing the name beside her mailbox. He politely explained that she had moved out the previous afternoon and left no forwarding address. Her neighbors knew nothing. Her favorite neighborhood cafe had not seen her. Even the small bookstore where she spent Saturday mornings had no idea where she had gone. Questions slowly turned into rumors. Someone suggested she had accepted a better position on the West Coast. Another claimed she had grown tired of waiting for a man consumed by business. I wanted to reject every story, yet silence has a cruel way of sounding like confirmation. So I buried my doubts beneath work, convincing myself she had walked away by choice, never realizing that while I searched for answers, the truth had already begun disappearing behind carefully closed doors. The years that followed looked impressive from the outside and completely empty from where I stood. Blackwood Holdings expanded into new markets, acquired landmark buildings across Manhattan, and appeared on the front pages of business magazines so often that I eventually stopped reading them. Television anchors called me one of the youngest corporate leaders to reshape the city's financial landscape. Investors praised my discipline. Shareholders celebrated every quarterly report. They all believed success had fulfilled me. None of them knew I measured time by a woman who had disappeared without saying goodbye. I never removed Claire's number from my phone. Every time I upgraded to a new device, her contact moved with me. Sometimes after midnight, when the skyline shimmered outside the windows of my penthouse and the city finally grew quiet, I would scroll through my contacts until I reached her name. My thumb always hovered above the call button for a few seconds before I locked the screen again. Hope can survive much longer than pride, but eventually even hope learns to whisper instead of shout. I quietly hired private investigators over the years, never asking them to invade anyone's life or cross legal boundaries. I simply asked them to find Claire Bennett. Every report returned with the same disappointing conclusion. No confirmed address. No recent employment history. No verified photographs. It was as though she had erased herself from the world the day she left Blackwood Tower. Eventually, I convinced myself that perhaps disappearing had been exactly what she wanted. Believing that lie became easier than wondering whether I had somehow failed the only person who ever looked at Damien instead of the title attached to my name. Friends encouraged me to move forward. Business partners introduced me to remarkable women during charity galas and fundraising dinners. They were intelligent, accomplished, and genuinely kind. I respected every one of them. Yet every conversation reminded me of someone who was no longer there. I realized I had spent years protecting my heart by pretending it no longer existed. Then one crisp Saturday afternoon in early October, I attended a literacy fundraiser in Central Park on behalf of the Blackwood Foundation. It was the kind of event my public relations team insisted I attend every year. Families wandered between reading tents while volunteers handed out children's books and hot apple cider. Autumn leaves drifted through the cool air, covering the walking paths in shades of gold and crimson. Laughter echoed across the lawn as children chased one another between activity tables. It was peaceful in a way my own life had not been for years. I had just finished speaking with the event coordinator when a bright red soccer ball rolled gently across the pavement and stopped against my polished dress shoe. I bent down, picked it up, and heard a small voice call out, "Excuse me, mister. That is mine." I turned and found a little boy standing several yards away. He looked no older than 7. His brown hair moved with the autumn breeze, and his cheeks were flushed from running. Yet none of that caught my attention. It was his eyes. Gray-blue, calm, familiar. They looked exactly like the ones staring back at me every morning in the mirror. For a moment, the sounds of the park faded into the distance. The boy smiled politely, thanked me when I handed him the ball, and before running away, he noticed an elderly volunteer struggling to carry a heavy box of books. Without hesitation, he placed the soccer ball on the grass and hurried over to help, pushing with all the determination his small shoulders could manage until another volunteer stepped in. Watching him, I felt something I could not explain. It was not recognition alone. It was the unsettling feeling that somehow I was looking at a reflection of the man I might have become if life had taken a very different path. The little boy accepted the soccer ball with a smile that felt strangely familiar, as though I had seen it somewhere long before that afternoon. "Thank you, mister," he said politely before turning back toward the reading tents. I should have walked away. My schedule was already running behind, and another meeting waited downtown within the hour. Instead, I found myself watching him cross the lawn with quiet confidence, greeting volunteers by name and stopping every few steps to help someone without being asked. An elderly man accidentally dropped several children's books onto the sidewalk, and before anyone else reacted, the boy knelt to gather every last one, carefully brushing a few leaves from the covers before stacking them neatly in the volunteer's arms. The older gentleman smiled warmly. "You always save the day, Ethan." "Ethan." I repeated the name silently. It settled somewhere deep inside me for reasons I could not explain. The event coordinator noticed me watching and laughed softly. "He comes here almost every weekend. If every child had his heart, my job would be much easier." "He seems well raised," I answered without taking my eyes off the boy. "He is," she replied. "His mother volunteers here too. She says books can change lives." Those words reached me before I understood why they mattered. Books can change lives. Claire used to say almost the exact same thing whenever she convinced me to leave work early and visit the little independent bookstore near Bryant Park. She believed every story allowed someone to borrow hope from another person's life. I remembered teasing her that she sounded like a novelist instead of an executive assistant. She only laughed and handed me another book. The memory disappeared as quickly as it arrived when my phone vibrated in my pocket. My assistant was reminding me about my next appointment, but I barely listened. Across the lawn, Ethan picked up a cardboard box nearly half his height and carried it toward the largest reading tent. Before disappearing inside, he looked back over his shoulder and smiled at me again with the effortless kindness children offer without expecting anything in return. Something inside me refused to let the moment end there. I thanked the coordinator for organizing such a remarkable event, then asked as casually as I could, "Does Ethan attend school nearby?" She nodded. "Brooklyn." His mother wanted him to grow up somewhere quieter. Brooklyn. The word settled heavily in my thoughts. Claire had lived in Brooklyn before she vanished. I immediately dismissed the coincidence, telling myself New York was filled with thousands of mothers and thousands of little boys. Yet my instincts had built an empire long before my business did, and they had rarely failed me. I returned to Blackwood Tower carrying a question that refused to leave my mind. That evening I called Daniel Brooks, the head of corporate security and one of the few people I trusted without reservation. Daniel arrived within minutes, carrying his usual leather notebook instead of a tablet because he knew personal conversations deserved fewer screens. I looked out across the Manhattan skyline before speaking. I need your help finding someone. Daniel waited quietly. He never interrupted when silence mattered. A little boy named Ethan, I finally said. I am not asking you to invade anyone's privacy or bend any rules. I only want to know who he is and whether his family has any connection to someone I once knew. Daniel studied my expression for a moment before nodding once. I understand. As he left my office, the city lights shimmered against the windows like distant stars, but my attention remained fixed on one impossible thought. For the first time in 7 years, hope no longer felt like a memory. It felt like the beginning of a truth waiting to be uncovered. Early the next morning, Daniel placed a slim gray folder on my desk without saying a word. He had always understood that silence carries more respect than unnecessary explanations. I looked at the file for several seconds before opening it, almost afraid that whatever waited inside would either destroy the hope growing inside me or make it impossible to ignore. The first page contained only a name. Ethan Bennett, 7 years old, resident of Brooklyn, excellent attendance at school, regular volunteer at the Literacy Foundation. No unusual records, no alarming details. Just the quiet life of a little boy who spent his weekends reading stories instead of staring at screens. I turned to the next page. Mother's name, Claire Bennett. The room seemed to lose every sound at once. My fingers tightened around the edge of the folder as if letting go would somehow change what I had just read. Daniel remained standing across the office, waiting patiently while I continued reading. Claire had worked as a children's librarian for the last 5 years. Before that, there was almost no employment history for nearly 2 years following her resignation from Blackwood Holdings. She had rented a modest apartment in Brooklyn, volunteered regularly, and lived a life so ordinary that no investigator searching only through business circles would ever have found her. Suddenly, every failed search over the last 7 years made painful sense. We had been looking for the woman who disappeared from the corporate world. We had never thought to look for the mother who quietly built a new life among children's books and neighborhood libraries. I reached the final section of the report where Daniel had organized several public records in chronological order. My eyes stopped on Ethan's birth certificate. I read the date once. Then again, my heartbeat became uneven. I slowly pulled Claire's dismissal form from the drawer beside my desk and placed it next to the birth record. The two documents rested side by side beneath the morning sunlight pouring through the windows. I counted the months between the dates one careful number at a time, hoping my calculations would somehow prove my growing suspicion wrong. They never did. Every timeline aligned with frightening precision. Claire had left the company while carrying a child who would be born only months later. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Every lonely night, every unanswered call, every rumor I had accepted without proof suddenly felt like another stone added to a wall built on lies. I remembered the excitement in Claire's voice the morning she asked to see me after work because she had something important to share. I had spent years believing she wanted to end our relationship. Now another possibility stood quietly before me, one so overwhelming that I could barely breathe. What if she had been trying to tell me that I was going to become a father? Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. There is something else. He handed me a recent photograph taken during one of the Literacy Foundation events. Claire stood beside Ethan beneath colorful paper decorations, smiling as he proudly held up a certificate for completing a reading challenge. I stared into the little boy's gray-blue eyes. They were not simply similar to mine anymore. They were unmistakable. For the first time in 7 years, I was no longer searching for a missing woman. I was searching for the truth about a family I never knew I had. For 2 days, I carried Ethan's photograph with me everywhere I went. It rested inside the leather folder on my desk during board meetings, traveled beside me in the back seat of my car, and sat on the table beside untouched cups of coffee while I stared through office windows long after sunset. Every time I looked at his smile, another memory of Claire returned with painful clarity. I remembered the way she always stopped to help strangers without expecting recognition. I remembered how she believed every child deserved to be heard. Looking at Ethan, I saw pieces of both of us woven together into a life I had never been given the chance to know. I could have driven straight to Claire's apartment the moment Daniel handed me the report. I could have demanded answers fueled by years of unanswered questions. Instead, I waited. If the truth had been hidden for 7 years, It deserved to be approached with patience instead of anger. Daniel quietly arranged a meeting between Blackwood Holdings and the Literacy Foundation to discuss expanding our educational grant. It was a legitimate partnership, not an excuse. I wanted Claire to see me as someone willing to support the work she cared about before asking her to revisit the hardest chapter of our lives. 2 mornings later, I walked into the neighborhood library in Brooklyn carrying a slim presentation folder instead of a briefcase. The building smelled faintly of old paper, fresh coffee, and polished wood. Sunlight poured through tall windows, warming colorful rugs where children sat listening to volunteers read picture books aloud. The room felt peaceful in a way no corporate boardroom ever could. I found Claire kneeling beside a little girl, helping her sound out difficult words one patient sentence at a time. She smiled with the same quiet kindness I had never forgotten. For one impossible moment, I simply stood there, watching the woman I had searched for in memories instead of places. When she finally looked up, our eyes met across the room. Her smile disappeared. The book slipped gently from her hands onto the carpet. Neither of us spoke. 7 years of silence settled between us before either of us managed to breathe. The foundation director approached with cheerful enthusiasm, unaware of the history, standing only a few feet apart. She thanked me for supporting the literacy program before introducing us, as though we had never met. Claire gathered herself with remarkable composure and offered a polite greeting that sounded almost professional. I answered just as carefully because the library was filled with children who deserved laughter instead of tension. After the meeting concluded, I quietly asked whether we could speak somewhere private for a few minutes. Claire hesitated, glanced toward the reading corner where volunteers were helping the children, then nodded. We stepped into a small garden behind the library where autumn flowers bordered narrow stone pathways. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the air. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Finally, I looked directly into her eyes, the same eyes that had once imagined an entire future with me, and asked the only question that mattered. Claire, is Ethan my son? She closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, I saw neither anger nor fear. I saw years of quiet exhaustion. Her voice was barely louder than the wind moving through the trees when she answered with a single word that changed everything I believed about my past. Yes. Claire's answer settled over the garden with a silence heavier than any accusation could have been. I could hear children laughing somewhere inside the library, a few birds calling from the branches above us, and the distant hum of traffic drifting through Brooklyn, yet every sound seemed impossibly far away. I looked at her, searching for something that would tell me this was all a misunderstanding, but there was only honesty in her eyes. Honest pain, honest exhaustion, honest years I had never shared with her. Why did you never tell me? The question escaped before I could stop it. Claire lowered her gaze to the stone path beneath our feet. I tried. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle, as though she had repeated those words to herself countless times before this moment. The morning I asked you to meet me for dinner, I was going to tell you about the baby. I carried the ultrasound picture in my purse all day. My heart tightened. I remembered that day perfectly. The emergency flight, the rushed phone calls, the promise that I would explain everything when I returned. Claire slowly reached into her handbag and removed an old white envelope whose edges had softened with age. She held it carefully before placing it in my hands. Inside was a dismissal letter printed on Blackwood Holdings stationery. At the bottom was a signature that looked like mine at first glance, yet something about it felt wrong. I studied every letter until the truth became impossible to ignore. It was an imitation, close enough to fool someone who trusted it, not close enough to fool the man who had written his own name thousands of times. Your chief operating officer met me instead of you, Claire said quietly. He told me you had already approved my dismissal. He said you were leaving the country and wanted a clean separation before announcing your engagement to someone from another influential family. He told me I would only embarrass you if I tried to contact you. I looked up in disbelief. I never said any of those things. She nodded slowly. I know that now. I did not know it then. She explained how she called my office several times after signing the paperwork. Every message disappeared. Every email went unanswered. Security refused to let her upstairs because her employee access had already been canceled. By the time I returned from London, she had convinced herself that silence was my answer. I almost mailed you the ultrasound picture, she whispered. I even wrote the letter. She smiled sadly. But after everything I had been told, I thought you deserved the life you had chosen. I could not force my way into it. I felt the weight of 7 lost years pressing against my chest. Every lonely birthday Ethan celebrated. Every first step. Every bedtime story. Every school recital. None of those moments had been taken from me by fate. They had been stolen by deception and my own unquestioning trust in the wrong people. Claire carefully unfolded another piece of paper from the envelope. It was a letter written in her handwriting, never mailed, its ink slightly faded with time. I kept this because I could never throw it away, she said softly. Part of me always hoped you would somehow learn the truth. I held the letter without opening it. My hands trembled as I looked back at the woman I had loved all those years ago. The greatest mistake of my life was not losing Claire. It was believing she had ever chosen to leave me. When I left the library that afternoon, I carried 2 things I had never expected to hold again: Claire's unfinished letter and the truth. Neither one made the weight on my shoulders any lighter. I returned to Blackwood Tower before sunset, but for the first time since becoming the head of my company, I ignored every meeting waiting on my calendar. Financial reports remained unopened. Contracts stayed unsigned. Nothing inside those conference rooms mattered more than the 7 years I could never recover. Daniel arrived quietly after receiving my message. I handed him Claire's dismissal letter, the forged signature, and the unopened envelope she had trusted me to keep. He examined each document carefully before looking back at me. "You were right," I said. "Someone built an entire lie while I was looking somewhere else." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we uncover every part of it." The investigation moved carefully over the following weeks. We reviewed archived email servers, executive approvals, travel records, internal security logs, and personnel files that had not been opened in years. Every discovery pointed in the same direction. My former chief operating officer had abused the authority I trusted him with while I was overseas. Claire's access to the building had been terminated before I returned. Telephone messages addressed to my office had been redirected. Several emails had been removed before reaching my account. Even my executive calendar had been quietly altered so no meeting with Claire could take place before my flight. None of it happened by accident. Every step had been planned to ensure we never had the chance to speak again. I sat alone in my office long after Daniel left, staring across the Manhattan skyline as evening lights reflected against the glass. For years I believed leadership meant seeing everything before anyone else did. Now I understood that trust without verification can become its own kind of blindness. The greatest failure of my life had not been losing a business opportunity. It had been losing precious years with the woman I loved and the son I never knew existed because I assumed the people around me deserved unquestioned confidence. When Daniel returned with the completed report, he asked only one question: "What happens now?" Years earlier, I might have answered with anger. I might have focused on revenge or pride. Instead, I looked at Ethan's photograph resting beside Claire's handwritten letter. The little boy was smiling while holding a stack of library books almost too large for his arms. That smile reminded me what truly mattered. "Everything moves through the proper legal and corporate process," I replied quietly. "The company will correct every false record. Outside counsel will handle the rest. I will not allow another lie to remain hidden." Daniel gave a respectful nod before leaving the office. 2 days later, I returned to the neighborhood library carrying nothing expensive and expecting nothing in return. I did not bring gifts to impress Ethan or promises I could not immediately keep. I carried only a well-loved copy of Charlotte's Web because Claire once told me it was the first book that ever made her cry. Ethan spotted me before I reached the reading corner. His face brightened with the same open smile I had begun thinking about every morning. He waved enthusiastically and hurried toward me, stopping just close enough to remain polite. "Hi, Mr. Damien," he said. "Are you here to read with us today?" I smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in years. "If that is all right with you," I answered. Ethan reached for my hand without hesitation and led me toward the circle of children waiting for story time. In that quiet moment, I realized that becoming his father would not begin with a title. It would begin with earning one ordinary Saturday at a time. The seasons changed quietly after that first Saturday in the library, and little by little, so did we. I stopped measuring my life by quarterly reports and started measuring it by the afternoons Ethan asked whether I would be coming to story time. Some weekends we read. together beneath the old oak tree outside the library. Other weekends we walked through Prospect Park, where he insisted on counting every duck in the pond, even though he always lost track before reaching 10. I discovered that he loved chocolate chip cookies, collected smooth stones from every place he visited, and believed every bedtime story deserved a happy ending. Claire never rushed any of it. She never told Ethan how to feel, and she never asked me to become someone I was not. She simply watched to see whether my actions would finally match the promises I had never been given the chance to keep. Trust returned slowly, exactly the way it should. There were no dramatic speeches, no impossible miracles, only ordinary days that slowly became extraordinary because we shared them together. One Saturday morning, Ethan invited me to attend his school reading celebration. I arrived early and quietly took a seat near the back of the auditorium because I still was not certain where I belonged. Parents filled the room carrying flowers, cameras, and homemade signs with their children's names written in bright colors. Claire noticed me standing alone before the program began. Without saying a word, she walked over, smiled gently, and moved the empty chair beside her a few inches closer. It was such a small gesture that most people would never have noticed it, yet to me it meant more than every business award hanging inside my office. During the ceremony, Ethan confidently walked onto the stage carrying his favorite novel. His teacher asked each student to explain why reading mattered so much to them. When it was Ethan's turn, he looked out across the audience until his eyes found Claire and me sitting together. Then he smiled. "My mom taught me that books help people understand each other," he said proudly. "And Mr. Damien taught me that good people never stop coming back when they love someone." I felt my vision blur before I realized tears had reached my eyes. Claire quietly reached for my hand, and this time neither of us pulled away. After the ceremony, we walked together beneath warm spring sunshine, while Ethan skipped ahead along the sidewalk, stopping every few feet to point out blooming flowers or birds building nests in the trees. Life was still imperfect. We could never recover the birthdays, holidays, or quiet evenings we had lost. Time never returns what it has already taken. Yet I finally understood something that had escaped me for years. Love is not measured by the moments you miss. It is measured by what you choose to do with the moments you are still given. Months later, I stood once again inside my office at Blackwood Tower, looking out across the same Manhattan skyline that had once felt so empty. The city had not changed. The buildings were still there. The meetings continued. The contracts kept arriving. The difference was no longer outside the window. It was inside me. I no longer believed the greatest achievement of my life was the empire I had built. Every tower, every company, every headline would someday belong to someone else. But when Ethan reached for my hand before crossing a street, and when Claire smiled at me without carrying the weight of yesterday between us, I finally understood what success truly looked like. Some signatures can separate lives for years, but forgiveness, earned one quiet day at a time, has the power to write an entirely new ending.